Hi, welcome to Miss Richardson's U.S. History 5-Minute Lectures. This information will be U.S. Notes 2.19, Challenges to the New Deal. It includes information that aligns with the fourth and final section on your Unit 2 study guide. Now remember, you have control of the lecture, so pause if you need to, write down any questions you have, and re-watch if you need to. And make sure you're using your study guide both to help you take notes and to review and study for the quizzes and tests. Let's go ahead and get started. While many Americans were very supportive of the New Deal and loved Roosevelt, there were others who were really unhappy with these new programs and governmental actions. So these critics can actually fit into two categories. We had liberal critics and we had conservative critics. Both were critical of the New Deal, but for very different reasons. So Roosevelt was a liberal. He was a Democrat and he was creating a bigger national government. He was adding to the government's role in everyday life. He was creating more programs. But for some, these are his liberal critics, Roosevelt was not doing enough. These critics believed that the New Deal was too moderate, it didn't do enough to stop the Great Depression, and that Roosevelt actually needed to push harder and to do more. These critics were very, very vocal in this area. They were critics like Father Coughlin, who was a radio host, and weekly he actually attacked Roosevelt for doing too little. So Roosevelt was giving his fireside chats weekly, and then Coughlin would respond with, this was too little and this was why it wasn't enough. Other liberal critics of Roosevelt and the New Deal included Senator Huey Long, who wanted to share the wealth, which really meant making the U.S. more socialist, so sharing the wealth among all Americans, dividing the wealth up equally. And Dr. Francis Townsend was another liberal critic, with the same complaint as all of the others. The New Deal just didn't do enough to end the Depression. On the other side, Roosevelt's conservative critics actually felt like this was too much. These individuals and groups, there were groups like the American Liberty League, felt that the New Deal gave the federal government too much power and was actually taking away states' rights and powers and individual rights and powers. They feared that the deficit spending money the government didn't actually have, would further hurt the U.S. economy. So they really thought this was just harmful to the government, to the U.S., and to the people. These conservative critics thought that the New Deal was unconstitutional and actually gave the national government power that it didn't have, and this power that it should not have. So the national government should not be able to do these things because the Constitution did not give it that power. So they led the charge against the New Deal in the Supreme Court. Due to their belief that the New Deal was unconstitutional, they actually challenged many of the New Deal programs in the courts. Though the majority of the public supported the New Deal, the courts actually did not always agree that it was constitutional. Based on appeals to the Supreme Court from conservative critics, the Supreme Court found several New Deal programs unconstitutional and actually threw them out. The NIRA and the AAA had actually been declared unconstitutional by 1936, and the Social Security Act and the Wagner Act were actually they were pending to be heard by the Supreme Court in that same year, 1936. So with that in mind, in 1936, Roosevelt developed his court packing plan. This was a plan to get the Supreme Court to support Franklin Roosevelt and his programs, specifically New Deal programs. He claimed the court was overburdened by the number of cases appealed each year. To help ease the burden, FDR wanted to add justices to the court, sharing the load. He sent a bill to Congress to add a new justice for each one over 70 years old who had not retired. So that actually would have allowed him to appoint 6 new justices to the Supreme Court. So there's 9 justices total, there would have been 15, so FDR would have had a majority no matter what. While Congress declared his plan void and actually did not pass his bill, the Supreme Court did realize there was a lot of pressure here and bowed down to that by allowing the Social Security Act and the Wagner Act to stay in play. So they upheld the Social Security and Wagner Act. Once FDR had their support, he didn't threaten to add any more justices. So while most Americans benefited from the New Deal and it gave them hope, there were those who were critical of FDR and his plans, and you need to understand the two different groups there. So liberal critics felt that it did too little, and conservatives felt that it did too much and overstepped the role of the federal government. Roosevelt had to defend his programs, and while mostly successful, he failed in his attempts to control the Supreme Court regarding the New Deal. So this is actually the end of U.S. Notes 2.19. Hopefully you learned something. Let me know if you have any questions.